Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 299 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you ask the average person on the street how Vikings solved their problems, they probably wouldn't say through lawyers. And yet, early Scandinavian people were sticklers for due process. But don't worry, the Viking legal world still had its spicy moments. This week, I spoke with Dr. Robert L. Lively about Vikings and conflict. Rob is a professor at Truckee Meadows Community College who has worked on such diverse topics as rhetoric and Star Trek Voyager. His new book is Vikings Behaving Reasonably, Nordic Hof in Civil and Legal Rhetoric. Our conversation on how a person became a Viking lawyer, what the process was for solving disputes, and how fixing bad behavior worked in this shame-based culture is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Rob, for joining me to talk about Vikings behaving reasonably. It is a pleasure to meet you. I'm glad we made this work after some technical difficulties. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
The first thing I have to ask you when it comes to a book like this is reading it, it felt like this was a book that you had to write. So tell us why you wrote this book.
This book is really, for me, it was really interesting because it was sort of a nice confluence of events. I'd been studying some rhetoric and I happened to have read Njal Saga. And in Njal Saga, there's a major court case there. And I started thinking about the legal aspects of their rhetoric. And then I started looking more and more into it, and it just sort of sprang from there. A lot of medieval rhetoric was predicated on, at least a history of rhetoric, medieval rhetoric, is predicated on James Murphy's 1974 book, Rhetoric in the Middle Ages. And in that book, he sort of breaks down medieval rhetoric only occurring in 3 instances, whether you're looking at the art of poetry, the art of letter writing, or the art of preaching. And as I was looking at some of the rhetoric in this court case in Njal Saga, I was seeing none of that. And so it was like, well, what's going on here? And so that made me delve deeper into looking at some of the rhetoric in the sagas and some of the early Nordic laws and things like that. And it just sort of springboard from there, kind of launched me into this looking at their civic and legal rhetoric and kind of a broad scale. It's sort of a popular conception, but there's so much misappropriation and misunderstanding of Nordic Viking culture anyway, that it's nice to see that they were actually like thinking about society and culture and law and, you know, not just these big sort of hulking dudes with bloody axes and things like that, which is almost like a comical stereotype.
Yeah, I mean, people are thinking always that Vikings are solving their problems with bloodshed, and this isn't what you found in your research. So we keep using the word rhetoric, and this is a big part of the scholarship that you've done. It seems like a big word, kind of a scary word sometimes. What does this word mean? Because it is a big label for something that we do all the time.
Yeah, and it also depends on who you read or who you sort of take a look at. Aristotle breaks down rhetoric to the art of persuasion, which is nice in a certain context. But Hauser, this rhetorician Hauser, said it's dealing with language, and it's language that gets people in groups to get things done, whether it be like legal, civic, in groups, whatever, and how we actually approach that. I guess it's kind of a persuasion, but it's using language to affect some kind of outcome. And that's what I saw a lot in their sagas, with the use of language and trying to mitigate violence, not actually cause violence. I mean, there's a lot of violence in the sagas, don't get me wrong, but that's because things fall apart. They don't start off that way, and people actually try throughout the sagas to stop violence, sometimes unsuccessfully.
So when we're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about language that is meant to persuade. So in the Viking world, who are the people that are trying to persuade? I mean, people don't usually have an idea of maybe a lawyer in a horned helmet, but this is almost what we're talking about, right? People who are trying to persuade in the Viking world.
Yeah, and just a clarification, Vikings didn't have horned helmets.
Yes.
That's more of a later invention from like opera in the 1890s. But the lawyers were often looked at in Iceland as being socially prestigious. If you were a lawyer, they'll mention it, like this guy was like the second best lawyer, the best lawyer, you know, whatever, or these two guys were like the best lawyers in Iceland. Lawyers I guess they would go under like a fosterage, I guess what we would call it, where they would be trained up in the law and, how to present their cases and everything. And they were held in fine social prestige. And then they would go to the quarter courts or the allthing and they would present their cases to the judges. But it was considered an honorable profession.
Now, if somebody decided that they wanted to be somebody who spoke the law, a lawyer, as we would call it today, was that their entire profession? Or did they do other things as well and they were just called upon to defend or prosecute people?
Yeah, most of the time they would have small farms or be farmers. A lot of people in the sagas had farmsteads, and then they also were known for practicing law. Iceland at the time wasn't super, super rich or anything, so they would have to have some sort of subsistence level job of farming and keeping sheep or whatever. And then they would also be considered a good lawyer, sort of the citizen lawyer.
I love that. So you're called up to defend someone, called up from taking care of your sheep, and all of a sudden you need to defend someone. That's not exactly how it went, because there were actual scheduled times when people would have a case presented before the people. So talk us through a thing.
The whole concept of things is a very old concept in the Nordic countries. And you'll see variations of the word thing or ting or something throughout Scandinavia, Scotland, Ireland, all along the coast where the Vikings settled. You'll find like little references to these places. The things were courts where people would get together and they would, use these things to hash out local difficulties, whether it be like, property disputes, maybe sometimes some interfamily disputes, things like that. But it was a way to take conflicts and actually resolve them peaceably. And so these courts would often occur in like the spring or something, and then they would resolve the smaller issues in these kind of quarter courts, at least in Iceland. And then if there were major cases or major problems, they would go to the allthing that's like on Thingvellir in Iceland, just a little southeast of Reykjavik today.
I was wondering how you found out about these things at all, because this is a culture and you can tell us when and where we're talking about, but this is mostly an oral culture. So rhetoric, super important. So how did you find out about this at all?
Well, we have a large corpus of the Icelandic sagas, and the Icelandic saga database has, a bunch of them, and you can pick them up. I mean, even like on Amazon, you can buy a bunch of different ones. And then like several scholars have done work on thing sites and things like that. Owens has a book called Things in the Viking World, which lays out the places and kind of what went on there. And Alexandra Sandmark, she's done some work on thing sites in Greenland, which is really fascinating, I thought. There's some really interesting scholars doing a lot of really interesting things. And I just hope I did them justice trying to synthesize all this material together. There's lots of talk about, things and thing sites, and they seem to have permeated this culture. Often they're outdoor sites where people got together and could work out their problems. Because keep in mind that, a lot of these small communities in Scandinavia at the time, they didn't have like a police department. They didn't have anything like that. So they didn't have any recourse of some kind of central policing or government to appeal problems to. So they had to kind of figure out a system for themselves and kind of agreed upon this sort of court system that they developed.
So let's talk through a case, for example. Well, imagine that I'm a dude, because the rules for women are a little bit different.
Yes.
I'm a dude. I'm a farmer. Somebody has stolen my sheep. What do I do about it?
Okay, so generally, if you were just like a worker who your sheep went missing and you think that maybe some other lords, they weren't even lords at the time, they were called Gothi, they were the small farmers, the person you've kind of sworn some kind of bond to, you would go to them and say, hey, I think this other person stole my sheep. The Gothi could go to the other farm head and talk to him and see if he can get the sheep back or whatever. And then if that didn't work, you could always take it to like a quarter court and present evidence that like, here's my sheep, blah, 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 and plead the case that way in front of a small quarter court. If things couldn't be resolved that way, things could devolve into violence. However, for something as small as a sheep, I think people would have probably seen reason to either return the sheep or make some kind of compensation for that. if things really got out of hand and there was like people started taking up sides over the sheep stealing or something, or maybe it was a habitual for this one farmer to swipe people's sheep, several Gothi might get together and actually bring a case to like the allthing or something to say like, hey, this guy's a habitual sheep stealer and we need some sort of major judgment. And that sort of shames people into keeping the correct kind of social interaction. That way you can get away with a lot of, not violence if you can kind of shame people or get enough people against them to where they kind of realize that I better straighten out a little bit,
Yes, especially because this is happening under the open sky. The whole community is there. So
Yes.
They're going to see if you're willing to pay a fine for my sheep or reconcile this. Everybody is going to know how reasonable you are when you're there in the middle of the court for everyone to see, right?
No, exactly. It's that kind of social pressure that kept people in line. And if you're living in a small, let me preface this a little bit, but the Vikings TV show was kind of fun and there were some interesting things they did, but a lot of it was centered on like, how violent, and everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you're living in a subsistence community, you have really harsh winters and like food can kind of be scarce. You don't want to go killing off a lot of your workforce because then everyone starves to death. It's not a good practical social solution. And so finding other, more reasonable kinds of ways to deal with these problems is really going to help the entire community because you can't afford this. If you've ever traveled to like some of the small villages in like Iceland along the coast or like villages in the fjords in Norway, which are really beautiful, you realize that if there's a problem, there's no one here to help you. You've got to figure it out yourself. We have cell phones and mass transit and everything, but if you go back to the Viking age, then there's not help coming. If you screw up and, you kill off half the population, there's not people to pick crops and take care of things. So it would become a huge problem socially if you like just grabbed your axe or a sword and attacked somebody every time you got mad.
Yeah, it's not very efficient. I mean, I'm laughing a little bit because I grew up in Northern Ontario and we knew better than to feud with any of our neighbors in the middle of winter because you don't know if you're going to need help later on.
Exactly. It's alluring to see all these like, long ships and axes. It's kind of cool. I get it. But at the same time, it's not practical whatsoever.
Yeah. And there's lots of structures in place for alternatives, right? So what were some of the alternatives to violence? If somebody needs to be punished somehow, what did people do to make sure that things were resolved?
First off, there was always some kind of redress. You've done something wrong, you're going to redress it either through payment or something, So that was always a possibility. If the person is shown that it's become kind of a continuing problem, I mean, you can always sue. And they did this in the sagas. They would say stuff like, we're going to ask for like 3 years of outlawry, where you had to leave Iceland for 3 years. People would cool off. A lot of times the people who left would either become traders so they could acquire some money or they would raid and then they would come back and everything would kind of cool down and maybe they'd come back with some money so they could sort of pay off or sort of settle some debts or whatever. And then if people were really bad and they were a constant problem and they were like killing people and they wouldn't do stuff, they would sentence them to full outlawry where you're like banished forever. You can't come back here. If you do, then we can kill you because it becomes a societal problem because you're such a bad dude. Those are extreme cases where you like banish someone forever. You could repair your reputation with the village or whatever. If you'd done something wrong, you could always offer to the other person a self-judgment to like, what do you think I owe you? And then I'll just pay it, and that shows contrition because you're willing to let the other person set the price.
Yeah, I think that contrition is a really important part of this whole construction of making social structures work. And
Yeah.
I also think one of the things that you mentioned that is important is we often think or we see Vikings depicted as going off and raiding for glory or just because they have lots of bloodlust or something. But imagine you're going off and raiding so that you can pay a fine, so that you can be integrated back into your own community so you don't have to go raiding again.
Yeah. I'm not going to say that the Viking age was completely harmless or anything like that. I'm not making that kind of statement, especially if you were outside of the Viking community. One of the reasons I think that some of the monasteries were hit along the English coast is they were easy targets. They weren't really defended on the seaside, so you could land your longship, raid. These guys had plenty of gold and not a lot of defenses. It was an easy way to make some money and then get out of there. But if you're dealing with your community, that's a wholly different subject. People weren't violent as much anyway towards their community, because this is their families, their clan, their loyalty. It kind of resided more locally at the time, I believe.
Well, I mean, it's important to make sure that we're not making them look like they're cuddly,
Yeah.
because we can't discount the fact that they were going raiding and things like that. And we also can't discount the fact that they are showing up to the things armed. And this
Yes.
is normal. And this is something that is expected. So you're going up to see your court case being presented, and you're coming there with arms just in case, right?
Yeah. Does that line, which I just loved in Njal Saga, and it says, we must always go fully armed to court, which I just think is kind of funny. The intent isn't there, for the violence, but at the same time, just in case, it's always good to have a spear handy,
Yeah, just in case they get violent, right? They might get violent, so I need to bring my sword or my axe with me.
Yeah, exactly. Jesse Byock talks about different aspects of like resolution for conflict. I think he has 3 different references in there of how to do it. But the last one is, if everything else is worked through and nothing's working, there's always that violent extreme that says we can kind of control the violence, and you can have either like a ritualized kind of duel, like a home gong or something, where this will solve it to a certain extent. It does become kind of problematic, but if nothing else works, then that's always a last resort.
Yes, we see this in the modern world as well, right? People will resort to violence as a last resort. Morality is a whole different discussion that
Yes, exactly.
we're not going to get into right now. But one of the things that you talk about that is important to your discussion of Viking culture, especially in this context, is it is a shame culture, not a guilt culture. So tell us the difference between these two, because I thought this was a really interesting and important part of your book.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I started looking at it sort of like the heroic structure, and looking at some of the classical models like in Greece and stuff like that, this idea of shame. The lens of a shame culture is outside of you. So society determines what they consider sort of acceptable behavior. And if you break that societal construct, then you can be shamed. They will hold you up to some kind of societal expectation. And if you don't meet that, then you can be shamed. And there's all kinds of ways that they do shaming. And we can talk about that later if you'd like. But the society itself determines that kind of morality, I guess if you want to call it. But the lens of looking at stuff is outside of you. Society says it's okay, it's okay. If society says it's okay to kill somebody in these instances, then if you do that, then they're not going to look down on you. You won't be shamed. And so it's just kind of a different focus. In guilt culture, the lens is interior to you, right? So you're sort of this lens looking out, and you have sort of an ingrained sense of what's right or what's wrong or what's acceptable and what's not. And if you break that, no one tells you that you're a bad person. You just feel it. And this is a huge thing with a lot of the monotheistic religions, this idea of guilt. Christianity is considered to be a guilt culture because you kind of feel guilty for doing bad things, breaking taboo. But it wouldn't necessarily have been that way for the medieval Scandinavians. Scandinavia converted to Christianity much later, and then the spread wouldn't have been instantaneous. It would have taken some time to go through. But a lot of people early on thought that an evolution from shame culture was to guilt culture. And I think that's just sort of like a Christian bias towards the more guilt culture focused. But a lot of the medieval Scandinavians would have been shame culture. What society thought and said would have been hugely important to them, and it would have affected the way they interacted socially within their community.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking about how this works in the modern world. Like, is there a comparison where I think you can find it in thinking about apologies, right? In the Viking world, if you said, I'm sorry you feel that way, and you made reparation with fine or something, then that's fine because you've healed the breach at a societal level. Whereas these days we are sort of in a guilt culture in that, like, if you don't say sorry and actually feel bad about it, then it's not a real apology. You're supposed to feel bad about it. And if you don't, then that's not a real apology. Is that sort of a good comparison, do you think?
Yeah, I think the intent, in the guilt culture, if you said, I'm sorry, and, you don't really feel sorry, then is it really an apology? I mean, I'm sure you probably had your mom or something like, say you're sorry, and you're like, sorry, and like, say it like you mean it.
Yeah.
But the idea of a shame culture is, if you said, I'm sorry, or you redress something, and the community found that was acceptable, then that would be good. whether you felt that way or not, as long as it kept their honor and saved face in the community with that apology or whatever, or a gift or whatever you gave to address the situation, then they'd say like, okay, it's done. And then
Yeah.
you could just kind of move on with it. It's a different view than we have today.
Yeah. And it's important maybe to mention that sometimes the community did not accept that apology, did not accept that redress, and they expected more from the person who was being found guilty of something, right?
But yeah, I think it would depend on the size of the transgression. If you did something really horrible and you apologized and you offered something really minor as redress, and the community found that unacceptable, they wouldn't accept it. It would still be considered a shame.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have to be commensurate, I guess, with the amount of transgression.
Right. It has to actually fit the transgression that's happened. Otherwise, it won't be accepted. And this is really going to stick to you for a long time. And one of the things that you mentioned when we're talking about shame is that people will say that you should feel shame about something, even if you haven't admitted it yourself. And they will go and actually put a sign on your property, Godfather style, saying you should feel ashamed of yourself, right? Tell us about how that worked.
Oh, there is a great book. It's by this guy Sorensen called The Unmanly Man. And he talks about shame structures if you're like going to be considered sort of unmanly. And it is awesome. But he talks about the different types of neath, these ideas that, you've been shamed, right? So you can do several things. There's the tungu neath where you can just like slander somebody, shame them publicly, slandering them. There's one called the tray neath, which is that you actually go and carve an effigy of someone, like, having sex with an animal or something, and put it in front of their house. And then everybody walking by is just like, oh my God, look at this. And it's a public shaming thing. It's kind of wild. And then one of my favorites is you get the neath stong, the neath pole. In like Ale Saga, for instance, he's out and Eric Bloodaxe has supposedly taken some land from him illegally, but won't return it or pay him off for it or anything. So he cuts a pole, cuts a horse's head off, sticks it on the pole, leans it towards the house to show which person is getting shamed, and then carves like little curse runes on it so people can walk by and see the runes that are affecting this guy. The neath poles are just a crazy way to publicly shame someone. If you came out and saw this, you'd be like, wow, this is serious, because to do this, it's like taking it to the next level of shaming, because you're purposefully trying to curse or embarrass or someone. In Scandinavia, even today, they'll have instances of people using neath-like stuff. Just a few years ago in Iceland, a person did a neath pole towards a neighbor, and the cops thought it was serious enough to maybe considered as a death threat. During the Panama Papers scandal, one of the Icelandic politicians was involved with it, and people protested out in front of the allthing in Iceland, and they were using either dead cod on sticks, sort of like a little neath pole, or, people having little mini neath poles out there to sort of shame the politicians. And I think it's fascinating that this kind of rhetorical act, even after like 800 or 900 years, is still valid. I mean, people still know what that is. It's a public shaming event.
Yeah. I mean, even if you're outside of the culture, if someone is protesting you with a fish on a pole, I mean, you can imagine that this is something that is meant to make you feel like you have not done enough to deal with the problem that you have created.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. They've even used the idea of the shame, the neath pole, in video games. I don't know if do you play video games?
Yeah, sometimes, but I haven't played a Viking one, I have to admit.
In The Witcher 3, you go to this island of Skellige, and one of the quests is actually for this person to get rid of the curse from a neath pole.
Oh, there you go.
So yeah, you can find one in the game.
People can now play The Witcher and look for these neath poles.
Yeah, Witcher 3 has one, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Well, I love that people are looking back to history to inform these video games, even though The Witcher is not supposed to be in our particular world.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about shame. We're talking about trying to get people, if not to feel bad within, to at least redress their wrongs. And one of the things that you mentioned is that this is something that women employ as well. So we imagine that I was a dude with a lost sheep because what women have to do is different. So if I'm a woman on a farmstead by myself and I've lost a sheep, now what do I do?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. One of the things about a lot of the Viking court cases is usually it's run through sort of like the farmers, like the main farmers if you owned like a farmstead, you had some sort of like social standing. So you would go to the allthing, and maybe you'd bring some of your retainers along with you. But say like you're like a slave or a bondsman, or you're one of the women who work on the farm or like part of the family, and you're not allowed that access to the courts, then there's this whole thing that is possible called goading. And goading is something that occurs fairly regularly, actually, in the sagas for people that are not allowed that access to courts. They'll try to goad or shame someone into representing them. So say like you're off doing something and someone takes your sheep, and your husband is friends with the farmer and doesn't really want to raise a stink, and cause problems in the district or whatever. You're totally within your right to goad them to action. So you can kind of shame them publicly. Usually it'd be like at dinner time when everyone's gathered around, once again, a very public event. Then you can kind of shame them, saying like, hey, aren't you supposed to take action? Aren't you supposed to defend the farmstead? Aren't you supposed to protect our reputation? And try to goad your husband, brother, son, whoever sort of the person in charge to take action, whether it be to go talk to the other person, to take it to court, to do something. And at that time, if they choose not to, you can also keep shaming them until you actually get to the violence, saying like, hey, you haven't done anything. Now our reputation's shot. The only way to do this is to actually go get those sheep back. So
yeah, well, we talk about this in later ages where women are making persuasive arguments sort of behind the scenes. But in this culture, it is done very much in public. And this is the role of women to do this. It's not something that they should feel bad about or they should not be doing. This is their job to make sure that the reputation of the farm, for example, is upheld, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in a couple instances in the sagas themselves, there's a couple of just short lines where that's like a little comment from the peanut gallery where the people say like this was a good goad, or they agree that this was not goading or something. It's really funny that there'll be like a little comment about that, judging whether this was actually considered a goading or not a goading, kind of thing. But it's funny that obviously the writers considered it enough to put that little line in, like this is a sort of a thing that we do. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Right. And so we have women who are accused, especially in the early modern period, of being scolds. But this word actually means something important, right? It comes from somewhere important.
Scold actually comes from the word scald, which is an Old Norse word. The skalds, the poets there, they would also compose poetry that could shame people or praise them. But, if you were there and if you did something wrong and it was widely known enough, they could compose shame poetry saying that you're a bad person or not honorable or something. And that's bad, because then they travel around singing this song and then your reputation's shot everywhere.
That's definitely not what you want when somebody comes up with a really catchy song. And actually, I was reading your book and I was thinking about the Robin Hood cartoon, the Disney one, where people are singing that song about Prince John, and it's so catchy. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. I like that movie.
So not exactly a scald, but there's a song that people are singing that makes Prince John feel like he has to do something. And of course, he makes a very bad decision about what to do. Yeah. Right. So when we're talking about this and we're talking about public shaming and maybe going as far as putting a horse's head on a pole to shame people, it may sound unsophisticated, but this is actually a really sophisticated way of bringing the law forth and actually applying the law. And what I'm talking about is, it might sound like we're rap battling or throwing insults, but this is actually formulaic. And one of the things I found really interesting in your book is that when you brought a case before the court, if you did not follow the correct form, it could get tossed out on technicalities. So like this is as sophisticated as what's going on today in courts, right? So tell us about some of the formulas people were using and how things could get tossed out on technicalities.
Yeah, a lot of the law cases, the Icelandic law codes were written down, and there are others too. From Norway, you get like the Gula thing or the Frost thing. The Icelandic law codes were written down in this thing called the Graugaus, the Grey Goose laws. They wrote everything down, and these are sections on how to deal with certain types of legal problems. And they had these sort of like little formulaic passages that you'd sort of recite, and then you would present this to the case in order. And they had to follow a real particular legal procedure. And so when you presented, you had to sort of say these things formulaically to present your case and everything. And if you screwed up somehow, it potentially opens you up to having your case thrown out or being judged against because you didn't follow these real kind of formulaic procedures. And I'm sure that was much more complicated than I'm showing it here, but these ideas of set functions of these laws were hugely important because in Iceland at the allthing, it was a spectacle. It was like country fair, legal court, legislative session, a kind of cool thing to go to, I would think. People came from all over the country and met at the allthing and listened to people at the Law Rock. And, if you're a society that's built upon this sort of public performance, then they sort of expect a kind of performance. That's the way it would work. And so you'd have to have people swear oaths and recite cases and do these things in sort of a proper order to maintain the decorum. And if you messed up somehow, there would be problems. And this is really one of the main problems in Njal Saga, is that when the court case was being litigated, the guys who burned Njal, they were up to some shenanigans and they transferred the ownership of his farm to a different person. So then when the people who brought the case against them petitioned it in court, they cited the wrong place for the court to take place in. So it creates these little legal loopholes throughout. And that's one of the reasons it eventually degenerates into some violence, is because the other lawyer kept fiddling with the law, sort of one-upmanship kind of thing of changing it, resulting that the case was kind of thrown out. And that's why it became such a huge violence at the end of Njal Saga. But this idea that everything is really formulaic and had to be precise enough to where it would meet that public standard.
Right. And what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about these lawyers that are coming up and they're presenting their cases is I think we have sort of a heroic idea sometimes that somebody is just going to stand up there with no legal training and they're going to just blow everyone away. And so we see this sometimes a bit of hubris when people represent themselves in a court of law, which makes you think of that phrase, something like a man who represents himself as a fool for a lawyer. So how often do you think it would have been charisma that won the day over legal practice, legal technicalities?
I'm not sure I would classify it necessarily as charisma, but I would think if the person maybe had more social standing, a bigger retinue, something like that, then maybe people would see it would be better to find on his side. So necessarily bad things wouldn't happen to the rest of us. Yeah, it did happen. I think generally people wanted to do right, but sometimes if you had someone who was a pretty important person who had a huge land holding, brought a court case against someone, even if you think that the person who had the bigger retinue was in the wrong, you might side with them anyway, because in the long run it would help the village or whatever not to get this guy angry.
Right.
So it wasn't a perfect system, but I'd also like to point out that court cases today aren't a perfect system either.
Yes.
How often do people who are rich or people who are more powerful get all kinds of extra benefits in court rather than being poor or destitute or something? So no system is perfect.
Right. And I mean, it gets to your greater point, which is that people were trying to preserve the peace so that they're making decisions based on what is going to be the most peaceful outcome for the community, even if that means some people are getting away with things that maybe they shouldn't have if we're following strict moral or legal guidelines.
Yeah. I think for the most part, people tried to be reasonable about it. It was in their own benefit to be reasonable. The sagas, often they'll call them either Ohof, people who are completely unreasonable, or they'll call them like Oyavin, the sort of uneven people who are just mean or, not willing to work with their neighbors, stuff like that. I mean, there's negative terms in the sagas for these kinds of people, and they're not portrayed as nice people.
Mm-hmm. People can find a person who's not very nice sometimes or not very sincere. And it's obvious to the community, even if maybe they sometimes get away with murder. So the one thing that we haven't talked about, we've talked about lawyers, we've talked about the people who are coming and watching the procedure, but we haven't actually talked about who is making the judgment. So who makes the judgment in the end?
Actually, they would get together and they would appoint, several of the farmers, the farm holders to be a jury. They would vote.
Mm-hmm. And how many people are we thinking about for this?
It kind of depends on what kind of court you were in, but somewhere around 36, 48 people. They'd listen to the case, they would hear the arguments, whatever, and then they would vote. The voting, I think, was really important because it sort of showed if you have landholders from around the country listen and vote, then you're getting a pretty good public consensus of people who have some power.
Yes. Well, I'm thinking about how in the modern world, one of the important parts about the legal system is that you have a secret ballot when it comes to the jury. Maybe they can talk about it later, but you're not supposed to know how they vote. They all render their verdicts together. But I'm imagining in these things that we're talking about, these votes are pretty public as well, aren't they?
Yeah, everything would have to be public.
So if you're like, are you on, Thor's side or whatever, everybody raise your hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can tell who's going to be voting for you or not, and you'll remember that as well. So this is something to bear in mind when it comes to peacekeeping in these court cases, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's so different than some other types of voting. Whether you look at the Greeks who would take little bits of clay called ostraka and write something on it and drop it in a little bucket, or Romans might use colored stones or something to vote. So you could walk up and drop and then they count them, whatever. This appeared to be a pretty public event, where people would vote, and you'd have not only the judges, you'd have the lawyers and the other retinues of the two parties, but then other people just around as sort of just the gallery watching the stuff. So it was very public, very open, under the sky. It's quite an interesting setup of legality in this instance.
Yeah, and the various responsibilities that you have when you're weighing your decision, weighing it on the case that's presented before you, but also all of the other responsibilities, all the people looking at you, you might be shamed for this later.
Yeah. Historically, the biggest case that I found, I just think it's super fascinating, is for the conversion of Iceland to Christianity, because it was resolved through a court case. So many times you hear about conversion, crusade narratives and whatnot. It's always there was a war or a battle and it's by the sword kind of thing. But the Icelanders brought it to court. They presented sides, because a lot of feud had been going up between Christians and pagans at the time. And the Norwegian king was Christian, and, he was putting a lot of pressure to convert the Icelanders. And the law speaker at the time was a pagan, and Norway was threatening basically an embargo on Iceland. And so they had a case, and he thought about it, and he made both sides vow that whatever he decided that they would abide by publicly. And they said, okay, we're going to abide by this. And then he went off and thought about it and came back, and he judged that Iceland should become a Christian nation because it was better that Norway didn't cut off the supply chain, food, timber, stuff like that. But he said that hey, but if you're a pagan, you're still allowed to worship in private and whatnot. So it was really interesting because it's such a weird thing. You often think about either finding God or some kind of military conflict, and then people were forced to submit or something. But the Icelanders took it to a court case and they decided it that way.
Well, this to me speaks more of what history was actually like than what we see on TV, right? Although maybe it's not going to go so well for you if you pitch to Netflix or something. Let's just have these Vikings sitting around saying, let's talk about this. Maybe that won't work so well. But to me, this feels like what we would see if we dropped in on just about any moment in history, people sitting down and talking about what is going to be the best way forward rather than just swinging axes around everywhere.
Yeah, it's exactly right. We have a tendency to focus on it, and maybe it's the glamour or something, or the Hollywoodness of it, where we sort of focus on a lot of the violence and military campaigns and whatnot. And maybe that says something about how we are as a people, which is sort of sad if you think about it. But a lot of times through history, it is a lot of people, the bureaucrats, the people making arguments, sitting down, talking, working through treaties that preserve peace. They're doing things that are never really going to get recorded all that much historically, or at least be thought of as very interesting. But if you were an average Scandinavian in the Middle Ages, your life had been probably pretty peaceful and pretty pastoral.
Yeah. And there's probably a lot of people who are not only interested in history, but probably a lot of lawyers listening to this right now and saying, thank you for this. We are peacemakers and we get a bad rap. But hey, we were important in the Viking Age just as we are important today.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for coming on and showing us how Vikings could and did behave reasonably, and how, in fact, this was a super important part of Viking culture. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
To find out more about Rob's work, you can visit his books page on the Arc Humanities Press website. That book is Vikings Behaving Reasonably, Nordic Hoff in Civic and Legal Rhetoric. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net's report coming to you direct from England.
Hi, Danielle. I'm still here in England for a couple more days. The International Medieval Congress was an amazing experience. Lots of great papers presented. A couple of them I want to tell you about quickly. Nick Morton detailed a whole war in the 13th century that historians didn't even know about. George Theotokos talked about the Byzantine general Belisarius putting a spin on the old hidden pit trap trick to defeat the Persians in battle. Lots of good stuff. You'll hear more about it in the coming weeks. Now, I was hoping to get some new pieces for the website while I was here. Unfortunately, my laptop had a bad encounter with a bottle of water, and it's not going to be working ever again. So that being the situation, I decided the best thing for me to do was to focus on our summer sale of online courses. We're going to extend it for another week, and we are now adding some more courses to that as well. So please check that out and use the coupon code SUMMER when you visit us at medievalstudies.thinkific.com. Thanks.
As Peter mentioned, there are a whole lot of online courses being offered in September, including an Introduction to the 14th Century by yours truly. So if you're interested in learning with me all about history's best and maybe worst century, get on medievalstudies.thinkific.com to scoop up your delicious discount with the coupon code SUMMER. And to get you in the mood to learn all about the 100 Years' War, why not tune in to my new mini-series this summer over on Dan Jones's podcast, This is History. I'll be hitting the airwaves in just a couple weeks to bring you the story of Francis Charles VI, the king who had it all until he turned to glass. If you've loved my series, The Iron King, check out The Glass King, which drops July 29th. Next week, this podcast hits 300 episodes. Can you believe it? And in celebration, I'm opening the floor to your questions. You can ask me anything for free over on Patreon at patreon.com/medievalist. Whether you're looking for the tea on podcasting, seeking answers to a burning historical question, or wondering if I actually do live like a monk. So go ahead, ask me anything. And while you're there, if you'd like to level up your membership to help me keep the AC running here at the Medieval Podcast, I will be eternally grateful, because it's your generosity that has made all this possible. So thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. For everything from lawyers to sawyers, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN-medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist, and you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.